Majuba Hill, South Africa, 1881. The soldier next to you clutches his throat and then slides to the floor gargling. Enraged, you lift your rifle and fire on the Boers advancing up the hill, taking pleasure when one of them grabs his leg and falls over. You're a British soldier on the summit of Majuba Hill, and everything has gone to hell. What had started as a jolly jaunt to teach the Boers a lesson has instead led to you being pinned down by rebel fire, your fellow soldiers being picked off, one by one. Now they are coming, fighting their way up the hill. You're surrounded by the dead and dying. No one seems to be in charge. No one is giving orders. It's chaos. Discipline is breaking down. If something isn't done soon, this army will break. General Colley walks by, head down, unsmiling, seemingly in a daze, his revolver hanging limply in his right hand. You shout at him, "General, sir, what are your orders? The Boers, they're almost at the summit." He turns and looks at you blankly. Then he just walks away without saying a word. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebildet und wollen diese 4 Jahre nutzen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In our last episode, the supposed master strategist and smartest man in the British Army, General Colley, suffered 2 bloody defeats at Laings Nek and Ingogo. Morale among the British is at rock bottom, and a large part of the original army is either dead or wounded. Worse, some are beginning to suspect that the pressure has become too much, and that Colley's mind has snapped. Colley continued to try and portray the bloody fiasco of Ingogo as a victory, but his men weren't buying it. Lieutenant Percival Marling wrote in his diary that, "One or more Pyrrhic victories like that, and we shan't have any army left at all." There was a ray of hope, however. The reinforcements from India and Britain were finally beginning to arrive. 15 days after the disaster at Ingogo, General Sir Evelyn Wood rode up with the Gordon Highlanders, fine troops, fresh from active service in Afghanistan, 2 squadrons of the aristocratic 15th Hussars, splendid cavalrymen, 2 more companies of the Green Jackets, and a naval brigade with 2 guns. Wood was actually senior to Colley, but he had agreed to serve under his old friend. This would turn out to be a fatal error. Wood was an excellent soldier, a hero in the Zulu War in 1879. He later won the Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny in 1857. He was also a great eccentric and one of the oddest officers in the 19th century British Army. He was a hypochondriac who was always constantly fidgeting, and his uniform, except for his medals, which he actually outlined in black to make them show up better — some said he wore them on his pyjamas — was a rumpled mess. His nose had been smashed to a pulp after trying to ride an angry giraffe for a bet. So far, these reinforcements were only replacing the men Colley had already lost, but it was enough to raise his hopes they could soon have another crack at the Boers. He had become obsessed with redemption, endlessly talking about Lord Chelmsford, who had been defeated by the Zulus at Isandlwana, but had then gambled on another battle and triumphed at Ulundi. He was terrified that peace negotiations would rob him of the chance to finally win a victory. As he wrote to his old mentor, General Wolseley, quote, "I am daily expecting to find ourselves negotiating with the Boer leaders as the acknowledged rulers of a victorious people, in which my failure at Laings Nek would have inflicted a deep and permanent injury on the British name and power in South Africa, which is not pleasant to contemplate." End quote. He was right to be worried. Back home, the politicians were fed up with yet another costly South African war. Annexing the Transvaal had always been contentious. When the Boers sent peace terms, they were willing to negotiate rather than waste more blood and treasure. This could have been the end of the whole war, if not for Colley's devious and completely mad plans. Colley delivered the government's response to the Boers on February 24th, but only allowed 48 hours for a reply. A bemused Nicholas Smith told Colley that Piet Joubert was 200 miles away at that time, and that it would take at least 4 days to get the message to him and return with a reply. Colley did not seem to care. Joubert received the British proposal around February the 28th and agreed to the terms, but his response did not reach Laings Nek until March the 7th. By then, Colley had already struck. He began obsessively observing the Boer positions through binoculars, spending hours watching them. Increasingly, his gaze seemed to fall upon Majuba Hill. Majuba was a square-topped extinct volcano rising 2,000 feet from the valley floor. It was a majestic bastion, more of a mountain than a hill, to the far right of the Boer camp on Laings Nek. So far, neither side had occupied it permanently, though Boer scouts did use it during the day. Colley decided to gamble and seize the hill for a night attack. He sent Wood off on a fool's errand to speed up the reinforcements. Poor Wood even told a war correspondent he met along the way that, "I have just left Colley, who has given me his word of honour that he will not move out of camp until I return." He had been deceived. Colley wanted him out of the camp, so no one could stop his plans. With Wood gone and most of his staff officers completely in the dark, Colley roused his men from their slumber. If the whole affair was already bizarre, Colley now made an incredibly strange decision. Rather than use his fresh reinforcements, he instead created a hodgepodge force made up of troops from all the different regiments under his command. This meant that there was little cohesion or esprit de corps in his force. In fact, the Highlanders, fresh from their victory in Afghanistan, actually looked down on those who fought in the previous defeats. Why did Colley do this? We'll be asking that question a lot in this episode. In this case, it seems that he wanted to give his men the chance of redemption as well. The 58th could wipe clean the stain of Laings Nek, the rifles Ingogo. While well-intentioned, he had created a force that wouldn't hold together if events went badly. As his troops lumbered under the cover of darkness towards Majuba, morale was mostly high for the moment. Even now, though, there was dissent in the ranks. Colonel Bond of the 58th received a report from one of his company commanders that, quote, "The men have lost confidence in Colley and had an idea that they will be led into another trap." End quote. Lieutenant Ian Hamilton of the 92nd overheard men from the 58th tell his Highlanders that, quote, "They wished we had brought the whole regiment." End quote. After a difficult ascent, They reached the top as dawn began to break. A war correspondent who joined the expedition later wrote that, quote, "The Boer army had risen from sleep, and in every tent and wagon there was a light. The valley, into which it seemed we could throw a stone, was a mass of light. It was a thrilling sight from our point of vantage. There was our enemy at our mercy and unaware of our proximity to them." End quote. Everyone waited for Colley to start giving orders. Surely he must have a plan. They waited some more, and they waited. Yet nothing happened. When you first arrived at the peak of Majuba Hill, you were full of excitement and ready for battle. Now, however, a creeping unease exists in the depth of your stomach. You're an aide to General Colley, but he isn't giving any orders or sharing his plans. Trying to gently nudge him, you say, "General, should we start entrenching our position here?" He looks at you blankly. No need for that. The men are exhausted. Let them rest." As he stares out over the valley, he says with a deep sigh, "We could stay here forever. Time for a well-earned nap." A nap, you think? Now? Is he crazy? "General, do you have any orders we can work on while you're napping?" No, not really," he says, as he lies down and starts snoring. Nonplussed, you turn to look at your fellow soldiers. In the absence of direction or leadership, discipline is already becoming slack. Soldiers are wandering around, talking, or joining their commander for a snooze. One group of Highlanders are openly shouting at the Boers below, "Come up here, you beggars!" There goes the element of surprise. Another officer raises his rifle and fires at the rebels, and then yells, "Too far away, damn it!" General Colley raises his head and mumbles, "Stop that firing," before going back to sleep. The officer ignores him, firing another shot. This feels like the beginning of a disaster. Why did Colley bring you here? He must have a plan. That is the golden question of the Battle of Majuba Hill. Why did Colley lead 554 men to occupy the hill in the first place? What was his plan? The summit of Majuba provided a fine view of the Boer positions, but the sides of the mountain were too steep for cannon, and the distance from the summit to the Boer lines was too great for rifles, as we saw in the dramatization. Even the Gatling guns were too heavy to haul up the mountain. That left the 3 rocket tubes, which they probably could have manhandled to the summit. They might have reached the Boer trenches, if barely. But Colley left these behind too. Whatever his plan was, he only had infantry to achieve it with. Perhaps he wanted to use Majuba to bypass Laings Nek and relieve the besieged garrisons. Yet unless supply wagons could make it through the pass, any such mission would be suicide. It has also been theorized that he arrogantly believed the Boers would flee at the mere sight of him and his men, a bloodless victory to end the campaign with, after so many disasters. Yet even this doesn't really ring true. In his last letter to his wife, he wrote, quote, "Don't let all things be dark to you, if I don't come back to you." End quote. He certainly doesn't seem to have believed that this gamble would be bloodless. Those are not the words of a man who believes he has every chance of coming back alive. I tend to side with those who believe he had no plan at all. This was a desperate last throw by a man in the advanced stages of mental collapse. His behaviour had already been bizarre before the battle even began, and now would only get worse. The Boers were first alerted to the British presence on Majuba by a Boer housewife named Mrs. de Jager. She galloped into camp on her pony early Sunday morning and pointed to some of the stragglers making their way to the summit. Piet Joubert squinted at the summit and then told her not to worry. They looked like mountain goats to him. "Since when," huffed Mrs. de Jager, "have mounted goats been dressed in red tunics?" Suitably dressed down, the Boer commanders began taking her more seriously. While Joubert rode to prepare the defences at Laings Nek for an expected attack, Smit called for volunteers to attack the hill. About 80 men quickly rode off towards Majuba, while Smit organised another group of about 150 and sent them riding around the hill to the west to cut off Colley's avenue of retreat. While some Boers kept up a long-range fire against the British positions, others, under Commandant Ferreira and Field Cornet Roos, split into two groups and began moving up the northeast face of Majuba Hill. Colley did nothing. Well, he did send a signal to his camp that all was very comfortable, Boers wasting ammunition, one man wounded in the foot. He ambled around the summit, laughing and joking with his soldiers, letting the initiative pass to the Boers. He seemed completely confident that his position was secure. However, what Smit knew, and what Colley hadn't bothered to discover, was that the north and west faces of the mountain were broken by terraces and gullies, and covered by deep grass. Good cover for the agile Boers. They knew, too, that once they reached the terraces at the top, they would be totally concealed from the British and invulnerable to their rifle fire. As the expected attack on Laings Nek didn't occur, more and more Boers joined the fight at Majuba. And Lieutenant Hamilton frantically tried to warn Colley multiple times that the rebels were massing for an attack, only to be turned away as Colley had gone to sleep again, and his aide didn't want to wake him up. As I said, Colley's behaviour just keeps getting weirder. By the time he did wake up, he was now facing 450 Boers. As he walked the perimeter with his aide and his old friend Commander Romilly, tragedy struck. As they peered down the mountain into a ravine, Romilly remarked that, quote, "I say, there's a man who looks as if he's going to try and shoot us." End quote. Only in a 19th century British army would someone casually say that. Rather than take cover, they continued to watch until a bullet entered Romilly's abdomen and came out the back of his neck. "I'm all right," he said. But he wasn't. The wound was mortal. Colley was distraught at the death of yet another friend, and his mood changed significantly. He was now reported to be gloomy and silent, with a grave, reserved expression. His behaviour became even more erratic. He sent a bizarre message to his camp, claiming the Boer attack had failed and that they were now fleeing. Then he went back to sleep. If you're counting at home, this is the third time Colley has had a nap. Frantically, the British troops tried to create some kind of cover from the Boer bullets, but it was pretty poor. A journalist at the battle later wrote that, quote, "Each man cast about for a few stones, made a breastwork for himself on the ridge by piling them loosely, one on top of the other. Anything more trumpery and miserable against a bullet could not be conceived." End quote. Meanwhile, the turning point of the battle was rapidly approaching. The commandos of Ferrier and Roos, by using the natural cover provided by the terrain and their own fire and movement tactics, had managed to approach close to the key point of the British position. A grassy knoll defended by the Highlanders on the northeast face of Majuba Hill.
Listen up, you wet behind the ears young ones. It's time to show if you can fight half as well as your elders. You'll be heading up that hill while the veterans cover you, yells your old Boer officer.
Inside, you release a sigh. At least you'll be free of his never-ending rants and harassment. His gaze swings to you, and he smiles sinisterly, like he can read your mind.
I'll be coming with you, young Jan. Don't you worry about not seeing me.
How does he do that, you think, as you and your fellow commandos begin ascending Majuba? It's hard going, trying to remain unseen, as the Runeks are distracted by fire from the veterans. The old Boer is like a mountain goat, surprisingly spry despite his advanced age. Soon you are positioned just below the Highlanders, right where they can't see you. The old Boer raises his hand, silently telling you to wait. Then he drops it. As one, you rise and fire a deafening volley straight into the British. Most are killed instantly. Those few that remain flee in terror. The knoll is yours as the old Boer yells,
"Now the slaughter can begin, young ones."
At the sound of the devastating volley fired at the Highlanders, Colley finally woke up and asked for a report. "About time, General." Great efforts were made by the officers to rally their men and get them back to their positions. Every effort was made to rush reinforcements to aid the Highlanders, who were bearing the brunt of the attack at this stage. Whilst the men obeyed, some of them did so with the utmost reluctance, which made it necessary for the officers to coax them, and there were many commands to move up. It was a mixed reserve consisting of 92nd, 58th, and Blue Jackets. Lieutenant Hamilton later wrote, quote, "I never saw such a mob as this reinforcement. Some were properly dressed, others were without helmets, coats, or belts. The whole formed a sort of mixed crowd being led on by their officers. I fancy they were considerably startled by being so suddenly hurried up, many of them out of a sound sleep. Anyway, I did not like the way they came on. As they approached the place where men had been, they opened a heavy fire, though I don't quite think they saw what they were firing at. The Boers, however, did not apparently much like the whistling of the bullets, and they drew back behind the crest of the knoll." End quote. Excessive nap-taking and poor marksmanship. This was the British Army at Majuba. There was a distinct lull in the firing at this stage. The officers attempted to separate and regroup their men. The Boers did not give them time to do this, however. Seeing the British troops massed together, they opened fire with deadly accuracy. As men began to fall in droves, the order went out to fix bayonets. Indeed, a bayonet charge at this moment could have saved the situation. But then Colley said, Wait a while." His officers begged him to allow a bayonet charge, but he kept refusing. Lieutenant Hamilton had a memorable exchange with Colley. "I do hope, General," he said, "that you will let us have a charge, and that you would not think it presumptuous on my part to have come up and asked you."
No presumption, Mr. Hamilton," said Colley, "but we will wait until the Boers advance on us, then give them a volley and a charge." It was the wrong decision. Again, the British did nothing and let the Boers dictate the battle. Captain Morris of the 58th Regiment later reported that Colley, quote, "seemed to have lost his head, to be overwhelmed by the appearance of affairs." End quote. The British line was anchored on the right at Hayes Knoll, but its defenders, under heavy fire, were already deserting their post. Anchoring the British position on the other side of the plateau was MacDonald's Knoll, and its defenders should have been in a good position to stop the Boers from crawling forward in the centre of the plateau. But another column of Boers had climbed the mountain and were now positioned on the western edge. They brought MacDonald's Knoll under a barrage of accurate rifle fire, and they were taking heavy casualties. Now the British were stuck together in the centre of the plateau, being raked by lethally accurate Boer bullets. No force could take this kind of punishment. J.A. Cameron of the London Standard yelled out to a British officer, "There's going to be a disaster here." Then the breaking point arrived. Your kilt and jacket are riddled with bullet holes. It's amazing you haven't been hit yet. Everything has gone to hell. Your officers are barely giving any orders. Bullets are pelting the hill all around you. Then a solitary Boer runs over the hill and shouts, "Come on now, you chaps! Come quickly! The English are flying!" More charge after him, and a volley of fire smashes into your ranks. It's the final straw. Your fellow soldiers begin to flee with cries of panic. An officer yells out, "What the devil are you doing? Come back! Come back!" No one listens. Everybody continues running. A Highlander in front of you shouts, "Oh my God!" as he is hit and falls to the floor. You have to jump over his dead body. Looking back, you see General Colley advancing towards the Boers alone, firing his pistol. Suddenly, his head snaps back and he falls to the floor. Soon, you're faced with a precipice and a sheer drop of 40 feet to escape. You hesitate, but when the soldier next to you's head explodes into crimson, you jump and thankfully land on your feet before fleeing down Majuba. The remaining British fled down the hill. One soldier said it had taken him 5 bloody hours to get up Majuba, but he touched the ground only 5 times on the way down. The Boers continued firing down at the retreating, panic-stricken British troops. A young Boer would later compare it to shooting deer. MacDonald's soldiers were the last men fighting. Eventually he told the few survivors he had left to flee as best they could. Except for himself and a Sergeant Giles of the 58th, every man of MacDonald's command had been hit. Giles and MacDonald were captured, but not before MacDonald laid into the Boers with kicks and blows. His life was spared by the pleas of one of the Boers, who, according to Carter, declared that, quote, "Such a brave man should not be shot." End quote. Majuba Hill had been an utter disaster for the British, one of the worst defeats in our history. Out of the 405 British soldiers on the hill, 92 were killed, 134 were wounded, and 59 were taken prisoner. That's an over 60% casualty rate. The Boers only suffered 2 dead, and 6 wounded. Even worse for the British, one of the dead was likely from friendly fire. Colley had been killed by a shot to the head. His last words may have been, "Oh, my men, do not run." 3 different Boers claimed to have killed him. One of them would climb up Majuba Hill on the anniversary of his death and put flowers on Colley's grave. Why had the British performance been so appalling? Most of the blame must fall on Colley. He seemingly had no plan when he took his troops to Majuba. He let the Boers seize the initiative. Didn't get his men to entrench themselves. He didn't properly scout the mountain's layout. He actually didn't provide any direction at all and went to sleep 3 times. When a bayonet charge may have saved his force, he refused to order one, for reasons that still remain unclear. He couldn't have done better if he'd actually wanted to cause a disaster. The best explanation is that Colley's mind had snapped. He wanted redemption for himself and his men. Instead, though, his own erratic conduct meant they suffered an even worse defeat. The British soldiers' poor marksmanship must also be blamed. Throughout this war, and especially at Majuba, the British fired thousands of rounds without hitting anything. The Boers claimed that British rifles captured at the hill were sighted at 400 yards. Most of the fighting, meanwhile, took place at distances of less than 200 yards. Perhaps it's not surprising they didn't hit anything. Defeat is always the engine of change for a military. It would take 15 years to be fully implemented, but the famous red coats would be retired and replaced by khaki. With rifles becoming faster and more accurate, they just stood out too much. Marksmanship began to get the attention it deserved, though this transition wouldn't be complete until after the early disasters of the Second Boer War. Majuba Hill became for the Boers what Bunker Hill is for Americans, or the Battle of Britain is for my own island home. It was celebrated every year as their greatest victory. Stunned by yet another terrible defeat, the British government wanted nothing more to do with the Transvaal. It regained its independence. Yet even as the Boers celebrated, their independence wouldn't last long. A huge gold strike in the Transvaal would once again turn British eyes back to the Boer states. A far more brutal Second Boer War erupted that would leave the Transvaal and Orange Free State devastated before it was done, their independence crushed. It would not be until 19 years later, during the Second Anglo-Boer War, that the shame of Majuba would be erased. On February the 27th, 1900, British General Lord Roberts forced the surrender of a 4,000-man Boer army at Paardeberg. The Boer commander, General Piet Cronje, remarked to Lord Roberts during the surrender, quote, "You have taken our Majuba Day away from us." End quote. Roberts had made the final attack on the anniversary of Majuba at the urging of a survivor of that battle, and the last British soldier left fighting on the field, then a lieutenant. But in 1900, he was General Hector MacDonald. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a review, or tell a friend. In our next episode, find out how the escape of a Nazi war criminal from justice led to the founding of the modern cocaine trade, fueled dictatorship and repression across South America, and almost led to the creation of a Fourth Reich in Bolivia. Join me for a murky and tangled tale involving Pablo Escobar, cocaine Nazis, Western intelligence services, and the Vatican. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.